The EDGE22 co-chairs and GBEF team chose the next plenary executive roundtable as the close of this conference. The hope is that all attendees leave San Diego with a deeper appreciation of supply chain complexities, challenges, and their direct relationship to and impact on the security of IT systems, smart industrial control devices, UAVs, and the billions of IoT devices, all of which can create and exploit vulnerabilities. Govini President and CEO Tara Murphy Doherty will moderate the roundtable. She has assembled an unmatched group of senior professionals, all of whom have direct responsibility over critical supply chain operations and policy considerations. Joining Tara are Robert Costello, Chief Information Officer, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency; Ben Myron, Vice President of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure, NextEra Energy, who also sits on the Cybersecurity Advisory Committee of Governor Ron DeSantis; Fred Runavar, Chief, Mission Assurance Division, Defense Information Systems Agency; Suda Vias, Chief Cyber Architect, Office of the Chief Information Officer, Department of Defense.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Don, for the introduction. Congratulations to you and Mary Shea and Laura and your amazing team on yet another phenomenal event. This one, an inaugural event as well, and I'm very honored to be here to wrap it up with this truly unmatched group of practitioners in the supply chain risk management space across the federal government. As Don mentioned, we do have, for the first time this year, our annual scorecard. Please take copies home for your colleagues, in addition for yourself. I feel like COVID set a lot of past traditions aside, but one, as a reminder, is you're supposed to bring the office a souvenir. So instead of buying chocolates at the airport, bring them something they can read. We at Govini have had a long partnership with GBEF and really value the conversations that have happened in this space. We like to think that we use data to put the fear of God in you about what's happening in national security, but Edward, if you're still here, boy, did you do that today. Really interesting presentation. We're gonna build on this supply chain risk management theme by talking today about how it is specific and unique within the space of information and communications technologies, how that impacts critical defense supply chains, critical homeland security supply chains, and the federal government overall, as well as the business practices of federal government. Thanks again to my panelists for joining. Really excited to hear from you. So let's get started. Bob, I'm gonna put the first question to you. Yesterday, I think Steve Ryan put this perfectly in summing up the challenge and did so in an incredibly pithy way. He said, we simply can't not know what's in our stuff anymore. And it's true. It has become a national imperative at this point to get our arms around the supply chain challenges we're facing. But this isn't a new challenge. Yes, COVID exposed fragility that we underestimated. Yes, globalization has propelled this. But what else is happening now that makes this such a pivotal issue?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, my role at CISA is different than different roles I've had at DHS over the last 14, 15 years or so. And I think one of the things that my kind of dual-headed role is, internally, I'm very concerned now with things that I wasn't maybe 20 years ago. I didn't suspect 20 years ago that maybe that router I got wasn't really from Cisco, or didn't have parts in it that maybe had been counterfeited or tampered with. And that's something that we are concerned with now, and certainly as well over at DHS. One of my prior roles at Customs and Border Protection, we just heard earlier on a lot of the issues with human rights and slave labor. And that's a big part of the role of the department, is verifying those supply chains to make sure that there is not slave labor in manufacturing. And that could be with information technology or with the clothes that we wear. So these are very important things to us over at DHS. I think in my role now, it's different than I anticipated maybe when I took it 10 months ago. And for me, it's a retraining. You know, the government was traditionally in some of the offices very just concerned with that paperwork security. You know, are we doing an ATO or you know, are we buying the right stuff? Is it on the technical reference model? And not going very deep into it. And I think now we're asking our partners to go a lot deeper into their suppliers. We're asking to verify that a lot more. I know we're going to talk about self-attestation and what goes into that. Should we accept it? Should we not? I really don't have a great answer on that. But I think what's really changed for me is I think we have to be a lot more careful. We have to train people a lot earlier. I have a lot of new developers that are doing really great work, but they don't see anything wrong pulling code from all over the world. Right. And we have to provide the right tools, at least on my side, to help verify that and scan it. And I think one of the other things that we're trying to work on as well, and this is something I remember back to my military days, I was always getting a lot of training. We're not always training on the civilian side to that level. Like, we don't discuss these issues enough. So we are not training developers or IT professionals to be looking for these things, what they should be looking for. I think it's great, all these standards that are out there. If you were to ask my team or the DHS headquarters team, it's a very small team of people doing this at DHS. And oftentimes it's too small, it's not automated enough, there's not a lot of partnership with industry to the level that it needs to be. And I think those are things that we need to work on. And I think that's what kind of changed for us. You know, we can look at solar winds, and there was a lot that went into solar winds. You know, it wasn't just that solar winds had a problem. We had problems across our configuration space on how we were doing things that allowed that event to essentially move lateral across so many different spaces. But I think for me, what I'm really concentrating on is training people, awareness, and then for those of us in government roles, it's very important that we're advocating through the budget cycle for the amount of money that we need to do these things. I talked about it at another panel how most of my budget goes to just keeping the lights on. And that's really difficult when you need to expand your workforce to do new work. That's absolutely critical, because we are doing still quite a bit of custom development internally, so I often have the same problems as any OEM out there as well.
Fantastic answer. You hit on so many things that I want this panel to come back to, and one that I hadn't thought to address at the outset, but is so incredibly important, which is the training and education piece of the workforce. And there are workforce challenges across the entire industrial base supporting all of our federal activities. The gap in training in this area is so acute for exactly what you said. We go into so many different offices on the Gavini side, and we sit down with these users who say, okay, I've got a mandate from leadership. I need to investigate risk in the supply chain. I need to figure out, are there Chinese parts in this weapon system? Are there Chinese suppliers in this IT system? But what is supply chain risk management? That's where the conversation begins. And we actually have put together a certification program that is a 1-week training course for anyone who's interested in the national security workforce, not just our government users, for this very reason, and to fill this gap. And I suspect we won't be the only ones to do so, but I'm very excited to see that take off this year. Suda, if you're mic'd up, and I could, I wanted to turn to you and actually pick up on some of what Bob was referring to. You know, the ATO focus and what we have learned over the past 15 years in cybersecurity has been phenomenal. And so how do we take some of the lessons, or what do you see within the cybersecurity realm that is either working or has been done well that might inform some of the approaches that we need in ICT, supply chain risk management?
Yeah, so great question. And on behalf of, I guess, all the panelists, I really appreciate being invited to this. the summit, and especially to this panel. So I think you hit a lot of the key topics, I think, there. So one of the biggest ones is, I'd say the threefold, is our laws, right? So one of the things that we've found out, especially as, I'm going to say the buzzword, the zero trust side, is the biggest concern I do have is how do you make sure that it enables, because we always go back to authorities and to what laws and policies we have on there. And so that's one of the things we're looking at from a supply chain risk management. The other thing that he'd mentioned is partnerships. And within DoD, I think it's like over 1,100 different companies, right? They range from the big ones, the 10,000 plus employees, to the 250 employees. Our focus is really, of course, across the board, but definitely the 250 plus employees, because they're asking for help. And so two of the areas that we've kind of, the biggest lessons learned, what I saw a shift in is before it was, why didn't you do X, Y, and Z, right, from DoD? And now it's more of a partnership where it's, hey, we have these tools, we're here to help you. And so we have the DoD CIO DIB, the Defense Industrial Base Partnership, which has over 1,000 team members on there representing about close to 500 different companies. But the main gist of that is the transparency of information. And what we've seen, at least what I've seen I've been with the DoD CIO for the last year and a half, is an increase of the company self-reporting. And when they self-report, they say, hey, this is what happened, how can you help? And then the second one is NSA standing up their Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. That's immense. And I would, if you haven't done so, I'd highly recommend you to reach out to them, because they not only provide support, but they provide the tools. And they've learned too, NSA is also, it's a partnership, so they've also learned from industry where you have some of the developers identifying ways to catch and identify different vulnerabilities. And so that's one area. And you mentioned the ATO. We're moving towards it being focusing on the R, the risk, right? It's been very compliance-based, it's paper-based. And so that's the whole continuous monitoring, which kind of ties into the zero trust strategy. We cannot be in a reactive mode. Again, I appreciate all the briefs that came before, because it kind of set this discussion here.
Definitely.
But that's one. I think the other thing too, it's SCRIM by far, at least I'm dating myself, one of the first things I did is program protection. And program protection, you look at the bomb, whether it's software or hardware. And the problem there back in the day was that it just took so long to get the reports back from the threat community. By the time we got it back, we're already milestone C, right? The things are being delivered. We already have our prototypes out. And then a decision's gonna be made. What's the risk of making sure that our warfighters have this capability versus the risk of a compromise? And so what we're seeing right now, it's actually a holistic view. And I believe some of the team members before mentioned it, where we can't look at these as stovepipe. It's how does it all fit together? How do we make sure we have an informed decision? And again, for supply chain, the biggest concern for me is we're all on board with zero trust. It's data. The data is a heartbeat. What are the unintended consequences? And how do we kind of jump ahead of that to make sure that we're not only, from a DoD perspective, we're not putting in just the requirements, we're putting it from a contractual perspective, but how are we making sure it's done through a partnership? And I'll extend it also to our mission partners, because we don't just work in a void, right? We're working, when a mission hits, we're seeing it right now on the Ukrainian side, is what do we need to do in order to make sure a mission is met? And then also from a veteran perspective, is we have a bunch of our veterans that also rely on services, so how do we make sure that supply chain is intact?
Great points. Okay, Fred, over to you. From your perspective, as you look at information systems for the Department of Defense, how do you think about making trade-offs in order to execute against a supply chain risk management strategy? One of the most traditional views in defense program land is, of course, the classic iron triangle: cost, schedule, performance. Any good engineer will tell you, you can get 2, but you can never get 3. There is, it seems, as we are on the other side of this highly globalized world, the exogenous threats we've seen, or events like COVID, there's a new iron triangle within SCRIM in particular. But the trade-offs are now among efficiency, resiliency and dominance. And in some cases, we certainly want to focus on resiliency, or in some cases, we might want that dominance, and there are entire supply chains that the United States just needs to own, or we need to reshore. But then there might still very much be places where we're willing to accept risk in those regards and drive efficiency. That's a really tough set of trade-offs. How do you think through that in your space?
So if you know anything about mythology, right, so you got Pandora's box and you open the lid and everything goes out, but hope remains under the lid. I think there's times that I don't even think hope is there, right, from my perspective. So DIS is the big bandwidth telecom provider for DoD. Every place we are, from Afghanistan to Southeast Asia, we provide that connectivity. We don't own it. We don't operate it. We rely upon it. So as we look at the missions that DoD has across the full spectrum of operations, there's some that are at the top. Frederick the Great once said, those who protect everything protect nothing. So you got to get back down to that. What is the most important thing that always has to be on, always has to be available? For DISA, capacity and diversity equals survivability, but there's certain things that you need to make sure that your PACE plan, your primary and alternate communication, is always available. You can't have a nuclear capability that doesn't have command and control or doesn't have the right level of efficiency. So as you look across that, the trade-offs really get back down to the things you can't have a trade-off and things that have to be always on and always operating. National security systems as defined are those critical systems, and there's covered systems within those systems that we have to make sure that are on and available. So working directly within DoD and with, I'm a retired Air Force guy, not a Navy guy, but the 3-SHIP principle, partnership, friendship, relationships. Get back down to that, looking at what we are using, where we're using it, what's most critical, and then those systems and subsystems have to be available. The tools that we're using, your tool is one of them, right, will help us go out and will give us that information, who owns the company, operates the company, where the foci concerns. And so as you strategize that, then you take a look at those things that have to be available, and that's where you can't take risk. If it's developed and manufactured in China and there's a tie back to the PRC, you got to say, hey, this is something we can't put on the network. The challenge you have, if you read the book, the Kill Chain, they talk about the acquisition process and why DoD is broken. And you hit on it, right? So by the time we get to the point to say we're going to buy it, we've tested it, there's a clear supply chain, it's already operating in the field, or we're 5 or 10 years behind the strategy. But ICT doesn't work that way. There's 136,000 companies that are in the ICT business today. 43% of them have direct ties to China. And oh, by the way, that's everything from routers to switches to servers to firewalls to software-driven platforms, software-defined networking, and it's very difficult. So again, you have to synergize that capability and what you have to have available. We prioritize that and say, okay, we're not going to look at everything today, but that has to be on for a national security system. And that's where we start making our risk decisions and making sure that we're not compromised.
Those numbers are staggering, so the Pandora's box reference makes a lot of help. It makes a lot of sense. Ben, I'm curious, from your perspective on the industry side, there must be places where industry can help. What do you think some of the areas that industry should be screaming from the top of its lungs, this is either where we are on the commercial sector and government, you need to adopt this, or we know we can help in this area, let us in and do it. We heard comments yesterday in the panels about, yes, talk to these companies earlier, right? It'll save you time doing your splaining on the back end. What do you think some of those areas are?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tara. And as I guess the voice of the private sector here today on the panel, I think there is a lot of partnership that needs to happen across the board. And I see the industry side not wanting to get too far out in front of our skis and trying to match and align timelines with government and kind of where all those things land, because this is a space that I do think needs to be sort of lockstep as we move forward. And the challenge with that obviously is you tend to go a little slower when you're trying to get everybody together and on the same page. And I think that's a bit where we're going. The great thing that I see right now is we've got a lot of steam. And so I think sort of 3 areas where I think government continues to help and partner and facilitate the work with the private sector and industries. And so the first one I think is that top level, governance around, hey, what should we be doing? How should we be thinking about software and supply chain risk management? And how do you help set and facilitate the groups where we're getting people together? I think one of the things we've struggled with in the past is how do we get our suppliers on board, right? So I'm an asset owner. How do we coordinate with our supplier base, get them on the same page? And then that has to work with some level of oversight, compliance. And I think government teams, DHS and CISA, we work closely with. And I think there's been a lot of progress in trying to facilitate those discussions. I think that needs to keep happening. And frankly, it probably needs to speed up for us to address the problem. I think the second thing that we continue to look for more support and progress is how do we get some level of independence outside of just our teams working together? And so I don't know if government can necessarily do that, but again, I think that helping to stand up independent review boards. We've seen a lot of progress and work in the aviation sector. We've talked about transportation, obviously. I think that needs to go broader and really focused on more of the technology and communications space as a whole, as a horizontal, versus maybe being in some of those verticals. And I think, again, a collaborative forum for us to drive some of those things, I think is really important. And then I think there's a lot of innovation, the third piece. We talk a lot about everything is sourced out of different countries. What do we do to incite and drive innovation within the US for some of these things that are really critical path for us? How are we building that pipeline of things that we can drive and build within the country that we can help get ahead of and understand really soup to nuts? How does it get built? Where's the software coming from? What are all the components? And yes, some of these other things we're working like SBOM are going to help drive that from a reactive standpoint. But if we don't set those wheels in motion now, I think we're going to be continuing to be reactive and falling behind, frankly.
You said a few things in there that I think are exactly the right next topic. One is partnership in this theme. Public, partner, private, public, partnership and collaboration.
3P.
Has to be, yes. If you can articulate it, then, that's half the battle. So how do we get after it? Because there's clear consensus that this is going to be so important to driving change. And as we heard in the previous presentation, SBOMs are an emerging topic or area, an approach where this issue of collaboration between government and the private sector is going to be on display or come to a head. So I'd love to hear from both Bob, you, and Sudha on where things stand with SBOM initiatives on the government side. Do you think the government's ready for implementation? I have to agree with our previous speaker. I worry deeply there will be a moment of, great, we got SBOMs, now what?
Sure, I'll go first. Hopefully the mic is working this time. Luckily I have a loud voice. Well, I think we heard a couple things, and CISA is doing something similar to NSA. We have the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative that I think has proven quite valuable, particularly starting in December with Log 4, and then starting earlier this year with Ukraine. And that's been really effective to allow us to share information very rapidly with our private sector partners in a secure manner. I think on SBOMs, you bring up a good point. I think we're still sometimes I can even walk the halls of CISA and hear 12 different explanations of what SBOMs are going to get us, and then we all do, well, not me. Those that have worked with me know I don't like meetings, but I'll hear someone say, well, let's have a big meeting and a big thing on it. I think it'll help. I think it's an incremental step. I think it's important that we know what's in the software that we're either purchasing or that we're developing ourselves. I think the government needs to hold itself to the same standard as others. I do have concerns that maybe I'm hearing things like I heard 3 to 4 years ago, Zero Trust is going to solve all our cybersecurity problems, and all these, or I always make the joke that for 25 years I've heard that, one product's going to give me a single pane of glass of all my networks and applications running, and that just doesn't happen. I think on our side, I think you're seeing a lot more communication from us on what CISA expects from SBOMs. I think I'd be interested to hear Sudha's thoughts as well, because one of the concerns that we're getting back is you're not putting it in your contracts. or it's not clear what you want us to deliver. And that's something that we have to really, it's been something I've been working on for a long time, even before I got to CISA, is the government needs to do good contracting, because it is a partnership, and if the contract doesn't lay out what's in there, or the expectations, then we really can't hold the vendor accountable for what we want. So I'm really seeing some good positive movement at DHS through that. We're doing a lot more industry engagement than CISA has in the past. Once a month we have an industry engagement event, so you can hear the problems that we're trying to solve. I think all of that will go into it. I think on the SBOM front, I'm not sure if we're ready. I know my team, probably not. I think it would be helpful. I think one of the areas we struggle with, we'll go back to log 4. That was a big struggle, I think, for everyone. It was widely used. We were often pinging vendors, is it in there, and waiting weeks for a response. I don't know that an SBOM would have solved that, because I don't know that we have all the systems in place to consume it and parse it and know where it all is. I think it's getting better, but I think it's kind of like zero trust. We're going to be talking about it for a while, and it is going to help, but it's not an overnight thing.
Right. Sudha.
Yeah, so I was trying not to get too depressed. I typically try to say, there's always
there's hope.
Or as he's like crush the hope. But I think one of the biggest things is when we talk about SBOMs or just bombs in general, they've been around, or the requirement's been there. It's just a matter of doing it. And I think what's kind of evolved, right, is before it was like a check. Okay, we gave the bill of materials. And then maybe to the point that the previous gentleman had mentioned is now what do you do with that information, right? And then it's a little bit reactive. And so what I see an opportunity here is one, there's a little bit, I don't say a little bit, there's a little bit more energy in regards to leveraging the current requirements we have and really exercising the authorities, but in a collaborative way. And I know Ben had mentioned the partnership. I'd say it has to be partnership on steroids right now. We talk about meeting up with industry and figuring out ways that to pull in and make sure that our skill force right here in the States is adapt or getting a little bit more advanced. But that's one of the things that I've noticed too is the last maybe year and a half is that collaboration on steroids with industry, and then of course we'll see with our other international partners. Having said that, I think there is a lot of work, and that goes back to leveraging AI. We can't continuously get the spreadsheets and try to decipher them and figure out. It just takes too long. And if we want to meet that nirvana of zero trust, we definitely are going to have to find a way to be more innovative, and that's where industry plays a role. That's where that partnership plays a role. Without that, we could continue as a status quo is not an option now. So the SBOM, definitely there's a hardware, but the other thing too, it's all about that data, right? And that's what I loved about another aspect from Edward Yu's thing is that there's similarities. So when I think about the SBOM, the parallelism is like the list of food ingredients, right, on a package. We could either opt to say, oh, we don't want to look at that food ingredients to know which ones are kind of detrimental to our health and which ones, we just opt to bypass it because we figure the risk is nominal. But I think that's where we really need to get to is understanding what, from that SBOM, what information do we need? And then also to Fred's point, we can't do it all. So how do we make sure that we understand what's in our network so we can then make the right decisions about which ones do we want to assume risk, which ones do we really need to focus our attention on?
Yeah. The collaboration on steroids point is a good one and goes hand in hand with the point that you made, Bob, on contracting, because as any decent manager knows, if you want agreement on something, put it in writing. And so I think there's an appetite from the industry side as well to have clarity on those expectations. And certainly from a data perspective, that data is valuable and isn't lost on industry. So you either get it written into a contract at the outset, and you're not having debates about technical data packages and ownership around data rights later on, or you end up having to solve it on the back end. Ben, from an industry perspective, what do you think incentivizes vendors in this space to buy into collaboration on steroids and their view of the SBOM dynamic?
Well, I think the first thing is everybody's starting to ask for SBOMs. And so whether that's contractually or part of review processes and things like that, but I think as this picks up, the more that everyone universally is starting to say, hey, this is a core requirement that we have in order to get comfortable with whatever it is that we're purchasing. I think as organizations start to do that, I think we'll start to see a big change and a lot faster change. And then I think on the back end of that, I think there's a lot of value of what's in it for me as a provider of a product on why it is something that I should be investing in and creating. And I think if we can, back to getting away from spreadsheets, I think the more that we can push the automation in a secure way to be able to then collect some of that information around the bill of materials, I think that's going to really help us understand the value on both sides. And so, like for us, we're already thinking about, okay, we're going to be able to search things and the usability in response to, understanding where there is a vulnerability that's come out, and having some of those capabilities is really important. But there's a lot of work that goes into that to be able to construct and build the automation, because it can't be, we're pushing paper around. It has to be a more universal system. And the only other thing I say is I've been doing this for a little while, and we have all these great ideas, and I've seen this a couple of times, and then we build it, and then we're like, wow, that's a really scary thing that we just built, and then we go and take it away because we built something that is, actually, potentially used for bad. And I worry a little bit about this space too, and just, piggybacking on Ed's talk earlier, we're going to have a whole lot of data that really maps the way all this stuff works, and if we're not careful, that can be really a bad thing as well.
Absolutely. Fred, from your perspective, so much experience in this space, you've seen people do this right, people do it poorly, where the gaps are. Give us some of that hope. Are there any bright spots from a best practices perspective? In the context of SBOMs, we don't have to start from scratch. It really, truly is a data problem, and the data exists. It's all in whether you're capable of connecting it. Are there other, even stepping back from SBOMs and looking at ICT, supply chain risk management more broadly, do you think there are bright spots or best practices that we can leverage as a starting point?
If you look at how we did supply chain risk management in DISA 4 years ago, something to be really concerning, whether it was a hack or whether it was a failure of a component. So then I had some of my folks, it was very small, I had a team of 3 people for all that comm around the world. And they'd get on the internet and they'd start Googling and searching, right? So now the tools that we use actually sweep the internet, right? So they use this artificial intelligence, and they do the acquisition of information and give us that, no kidding, Bob is really Chen, and Chen is really in Shanghai, and he's really tied to PRC and all the financing. So, it gives us that next level of analytics. So I'm really happy about that. But as you and I talked about yesterday, if I have a fork and a knife, and that fork is bad, we know it's bad, if I can never get left of acquisition, I can never change the dynamic of where we're at today. I think we're close. I think within the community, we are finding things in supply chain, to include software, right? We're close to say that's bad, we shouldn't use it. And then other folks that work in this business are saying, yeah, and this is what they're really doing. We start nailing that down, all of a sudden we start nailing down supply chains that we shouldn't be utilizing today. The National Defense Acquisition Act of 2019 and that Section 889 that calls out several companies was a huge step forward in the business that I'm in. I can all day long go to a camp post station. I've been so many places across this globe, especially when I did my time in the Middle East, and walk into a network operations center on a U.S. military installation and saw Huawei equipment there and say, oh my God, it shouldn't be there. Moreover, walk into one someplace else in Europe and see the same equipment, and normally when whatever telecom vendor buys equipment, it'll be shipped to a central staging place then they send it out to where they're installing it. When you see stuff coming from China directly to a U.S. military installation, you're like, wait a minute. And oh, by the way, that's Huawei. Didn't say the name. That's a product that we shouldn't be using.
Sure.
That's scary, but we're moving past that, and that's the good thing within the Department of Defense. We are actually getting to the point when intelligence services and our guys that are doing the supply chain analysis are teaming together on it, right? We're working directly with CISA on some of the alerts and advisories you're putting out, things that we may have overlooked. Again, that's that partnership. Industry is stepping forward and saying, hey, this is where we're going to go in the future with driven networking, right? And this is who we're partnering with. Then when we do our research, we can go back and say, we're not so comfortable with that. You want a contract, but the whole key is getting in front side of that contract to say, nope, they might be the cheapest, might be fastest to service, but there's a lot of risks we shouldn't take. We have some challenges with not putting stuff on contract, but we can at least get to the point where we say we're not going to put it on network, right? NSS systems always have to be on, always have to be available, right? Mm-hmm. Can't stop people from buying it. We're saying we're not going to put it on network, so why buy it, right? There's a whole bunch of legal framework with the Federal Acquisition Regulation and how we do stuff. So that's the good news story, right? We have a program now where we've put together over 500 due diligence analysis reports. And now we can say, of those, X number are good, X number are kind of not good, and these ones are horrible, right? That foci concern that we're tying that down to is giving us change management within DISA and the department. And, oh, by the way, we're sharing that with the Navy, with the Army, with the Air Force, with the combatant commands. And they're doing the same with us. So now it's not just us running these reports, we're working on the same format, using the same tools, getting the same information from industry and CISA. So now it's a teaming effort. That didn't exist 4 years ago. The tools that we're using, we weren't using 4 years ago. So there's your hope inside of Pandora's box.
That is a flicker. In fact, I was afraid to ask the information sharing question lest we lose the flicker and it goes out entirely, but that's really good to hear. And the progress is one thing, but when progress starts being redone the same way in a subscale fragmented approach, you just don't get the leverage that you need from tackling something at scale. So that's very exciting. In the midst of all of this is CISA. We've heard collaboration with CISA brought up over and over the course of the past few days. So can you make that flicker a little stronger, Bob? You see any bright spots?
I see a lot of bright spots, and it has been pretty fun to be out here and hear CISA's name mentioned so often. And I think we are doing a lot of really good work in a lot of different spaces, and even at a lot, you bring up a lot of good points about where we may be experiencing technology we shouldn't. One of the roles of CISA as well, which a lot of people don't know, we inherited a lot of missions when we were created, is we work a lot with the telecom companies. Day in and day out, we have a whole division that's dedicated to working with the telecoms, particularly on emergency communications, but on issues like 5G and a bunch of other really critical issues that touch every American's lives. And one of the areas that there was a good New York Times article on it and elsewhere, a lot of the rural carriers are really struggling with not purchasing Huawei because they simply can't afford the recommended products, we should say, or from the recommended companies. And I think that's something that we're concentrating on is working with them. I think our partnership with DoD is really getting a lot stronger, as well as with the intelligence community. The Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, is really starting to kick off. We're seeing a lot more companies join. And then particularly through our vulnerability management program, where we provide scanning services to either critical infrastructure or state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. We are signing up over this year over 10,000 new subscribers to CISA services to work with us, share information, allow us to provide services to them that maybe they can't themselves. I think we often do not pay enough attention to the state and local governments that don't have the resources of the federal government to protect their networks, and they are absolutely a vector for nation states You can get often the same type of personal information about American citizens from those as, we still talk about the OPM breach years ago. So I think there is a huge glimmer of hope for the work that CISA is doing, as well as the overall department. We heard a lot yesterday on what TSA is doing for the areas where they are the sector risk management agency that has a lot of, I wouldn't say overlap, but a lot of partnership with CISA. And I'm seeing that that's getting better, as well as our work with CBP and others. So I'm really starting to see every day increased collaboration. I'm getting lots of feedback from our customers that I support that they need better collaboration tools. So that must mean something. But I think there is more than a glimmer of hope. I think that the recent legislation, I would definitely encourage people. One of the areas where I always hear concern is, well, we didn't know it was happening. We'll participate in the rulemaking process. It's not fun, but it is open to the public and to private industry. And I really do. CISA wants input from our constituents, and we want to work with people.
Great. Sudha, I think if we had additional defense leaders here, one of the things at the DoD level that they would say is a bright spot is the establishment of the new Chief Digital and AI Officer.
Yes.
And I am optimistic about much, and what has me thinking about this is I think some of CISA's successes are its focus. And focus is important. And establishing a CDAO that reports to the Deputy Secretary of Defense prioritizes this mission. I would argue there still is no AI strategy for DoD. In things like AI that underpin what we've talked about today, the adoption of data in the Department for Security and other aspects, do you think there's a strategy in place?
Yes, I do. So we had the data strategy that came out about maybe a year ago. Signed off by Ms. Hicks, by the DSD. And so what you see the establishment for the CDAO was a strategic way of combining the DDS, the Defense Digital Service, which their pure mission is to take very complex challenges and resolve them. So the beauty about this is now you're partnering, you have DDS, you have AI, and then you have, which was JAIC, right? You had the Joint AI Center. And so you have the AI group, and then now you have the digital folks. Combining together, what we're seeing is, and this is maybe typically you have policy or memos ahead. This is where we're seeing actually results coming before all of that. And that's where a lot of the efforts that we're seeing in different parts of the world are resulting in some of the successes. And so that's, I think, when we talk about a strategy, one of the things we're also working with on the CDAO side is, again, there's elements within your favorite zero trust that has, for us, from a zero trust strategy perspective, AI is important. We cannot attain that, and again, it's a strategy, right? But it's how do we attain that nirvana or the concept of zero trust without AI? It's unfeasible. So when we're moving towards this AI strategy, it's a notion of moving away from this, I keep on saying status, but the stovepipe notion, right? We're just doing AI, don't talk to us. It's more about pulling in the right team members, and I believe Edward Yu was pretty good in stating this towards the end. The notion of cybersecurity just being focused alone is gone, right? You have to pull in the legal aspects, you have to pull in the contractual, you have to pull in the IT, the enterprise folks. And so that's where we're seeing at least the benefits and the at least acceleration in some of the efforts from CDAO folks. So the other thing too is, given where we are from a political standpoint, is accelerating some of those key efforts or initiatives that they're putting out right now. And that wouldn't be the case if it's layered a little bit below more layers of bureaucracy. So when it comes to strategy is going to evolve. Sure. But what I'm seeing right now, the difference is that we're even for the zero trust strategy, it's going to be published for us, but we're going out right now and we're executing. And so I think that's another difference in the evolution, how we're looking across the board in a holistic way from a cybersecurity perspective.
And any strategy is only as good as its execution.
At that point, yeah.
So let's come back to the people aspect of this, because that plays such an important role in strategy execution. Fred, do you think we have the workforce to do this right and solve this mission today?
No. Flat out, no. And here's the challenge. So, I put a uniform on in 1973. I enlisted in the Air Force in 1977. 1979, 78, I had a conversation with one of the individuals I worked with. He talked about the end of the world is coming. We were at 4.3 billion people on the planet. We're at 7-point-something billion people on the planet. Technology has driven that changing dynamic and where we were in 1980 to where we're at today. The evolution of capabilities that we're utilizing has driven that dynamic. But technology has changed so fast that it's hard to keep up with it. Believe it or not, when we used to work at JTF Juno, I was the guy that did the subnet masking for the folks going into Iraq, and building that network that we didn't have enough bandwidth to make sure we could fight that war. Well, that's ancient architecture the way that it sits today, just, 15, 20 years later. So what I see is every time we get within DoD the right people and they're trained, out the door to industry they go. Yeah. And why would you stay in the Air Force or the Navy, as an E5, E6, when they offer you a $100,000 signing bonus and a $200,000 salary? So the challenge that we have is how do you continually evolve the entire workforce to get us to where we're at? In supply chain, it's the same thing. The tools and the mechanisms that my folks are using today, we didn't have 4 or 5 years ago. So, and oh, by the way, I just had a changeover of the staff of 6 I had. 3 of them left for other jobs, right? Well, I can't pay my contractors more. I can't even hire them. So the reality of it is there is a huge demand space for people that are trained. Again, it has to get back to we as a community need to be continually looking at how to build this training to where a lot of people have some of the training. It's cost effective is the other portion of it. Because I will tell you from my perspective as a 60-something-year-old leader, it scares me how smart these individuals are, but it scares me even more when they walk out the door and I got to start from zero again with folks that are not necessarily where this individual was when they left. So no, we don't have the skill set. Talk about industrial control systems, right? The people that do the cyber resiliency and the cyber portion of that game, we do not, within the United States government, within industry, within DoD, have the right amount of trained people that can do it. So no, we don't.
Fred was staring at me through that. I could feel him saying.
That's okay, Ben. I want you to pile on and share what you think. Is this a national problem? Is it no, it's here. We've just got to figure out how to get these people excited about public service again.
Well, I can tell you, I do not have the skill sets myself to tackle that. So, no, look, I think from a workforce perspective, it's something I'm actually pretty passionate about because I think it is going to be the thing that changes how we view the space, and not just supply chain, but the whole gamut of even what we've been talking about around cyber and security, the whole conference. I think we need to get changes made in the way that we are educating our folks. And when I think about a lot of the conversation that even we've been having is, and it came up even with 5G, right? We just designed and built this brand new 5G next gen awesomeness system, and in the security communities, everybody's worried about it. There's a whole bunch of security concerns. Well, what was the gap? Where were the engineers at when we were designing and thinking about security for even 5G to say, hey, we actually need to think about some of these different things. It's going to be used broadly. How are we going to do forensics? How are we going to be doing some of the resiliency components we keep talking about? Some of that's in, and it's a lot better. But the gap is, in my opinion, the separation between how we think about security and how we think about engineering and technologists. And those things need to come together. And to do that, I think we need to educate in high school. I think we need to educate in universities and colleges. And instead of an engineer coming out, and I was an engineer, I didn't take any security classes in my engineering curriculum, and it's not in the engineering curriculum today. And so why isn't that? Why aren't we thinking about security with ethics and the other core curriculums that are happening in the university system? I think we need to go back, we need to change that. And I think if we do that, we're gonna start getting those folks going into the Northrop Grummons and the GEs and the Siemens and start actually redesigning the way we deliver those products and the software side of things in a way that is gonna hopefully change this for the future. But that's a long slog. That's a complexity that's gonna take us a while, to work through the system. And so that's the short-term piece, and then there's, I think the longer play on our workforce. And the short term is, I think we need to start really holding product and supply companies to a higher level standard, and really start hitting as a driving force or forcing function to say, hey, that's not acceptable anymore. And that's a hard conversation because there's a lot, certainly, in the private sector, you've got business outcomes you've got to drive, you've got things you've got committed. But until we can, unfortunately, maybe delay that procurement process a little bit, and not sacrifice the security components for, the outcomes that we want to deliver with the products we're getting. So, a couple quick thoughts there.
Absolutely.
That education, in my opinion, needs to start in middle school, way before college. We also were looking wrong at recruitment. We look a lot at this young boy and that young gentleman, and really there's 50% of our workforce, 53%, I think, in America, is being overlooked. The women, in technology is a strong driving factor. And this is a job everybody can do, right? There's no jobs that everybody can't do, but this is one we need everybody doing. So, that's the changing dynamic of the environment that we live in the United States, and where we need to drive this into the future to change where we're at today and where we're going in the future.
Well, I like that message so much. I think we should wrap there. Bob, Suda, Fred, Ben, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. You truly are at the top of your fields in this space, so I hope that you all enjoyed the panel and learned something. Thanks.